Welcome to Storymakers, the Storymakers podcast, a place where curiosity and play meet to spark faith through the imagination. I'm your host, Mel, and I will introduce you to new friends who will share hope for the kids and teens in your life, with a dose of encouragement for us grownups too. Let's get the party started. Hey, Storymakers, Mel here. So excited to have you on the pod with us because we have a new friend that I would love to introduce you to. And this is especially for all the grownups and parents out there who are raising kids. I want to introduce you to my friend, Rebekah Hannah. Rebekah, thank you so much for being with us today. We're so excited to have you.
Well, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Rebekah is here in New York. How long have you been in the city?
Well, technically, this is my third time moving back. So we've been here. My third time we've been here just a little over a year and a half. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Mm-hmm. Well, we've been here for 18 years,
Yep.
Going on 19. And I loved your bio. Your family has been called and made a decision to be in New York City. And we would love to hear a little bit about what it means to be in the city with. You have 3 kids, right?
I do.
Yeah. So what it means to be in a city like New York and moving through life and all the things.
Yeah, we've made a very purposeful decision in bringing our kids here. We lived here about 3 or 4 years. I had our middle child here. I gave birth to her here. And then my third child, I was fully pregnant with when we moved out of the city. And, the Lord has just taken us on a journey, and we always wanted to be in the city. I have personally felt like the Lord was calling me to the city since I was a teenager, but never, obviously, when you're 15, what do you know? You know nothing. I still know nothing, but my husband really wanted to be here, and we were gone during COVID. And so we were somewhere else and ended up being there much longer than we intended to be. So
I know so many of us, so many New Yorkers were like, we're just going to go away for the 2 weeks until Easter. And then like, 5 years later, it just happened.
It just happened. And man, I was on a journey when we were not here. And so the Lord really prepared us to come back, and bringing our kids here was a very purposeful decision. Culturally, it's hard, and we know that the conversations we have are hard. I think parenting is hard no matter where you live. So there is an intensity here that does make it a little bit more extreme. But I think in general, moving here was on purpose for our children to really understand that our purpose is to have an impact and to love Jesus first and foremost. And he's going to have an impact on our lives. And so what does that look like as we serve other people?
Yeah, that's awesome. And Rebekah, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about the work that you do in your ministry? It's so awesome.
Well, so I have 2 full-time jobs, which is
like
great.
A real New Yorker.
I know. People ask me all the time, how do you do it? I'm like, well, probably not well. I mean, who's doing everything well?
For the grace of God go I.
Yeah. And so I am on staff at Redeemer Lincoln Square, and I am the children and family director there. It's a kind of a post-COVID rebuild in a sense, because so many families left during COVID. And when they asked me to come do it, I laughed. I laughed out loud. I was like, no, what are you talking about? But here we are, and it's amazing. And I totally see what the Lord's doing. And then I also have a virtual counseling company ministry called Anchored Virtual, where I have 48 counselors now, which is crazy, and they are all over the world, and we do biblically grounded, clinically informed counseling.
That's amazing. We'd love to hear more about that, because I think that I don't know if you've read, right now there's so many hot books out there for parents, but Bad Therapy and Anxious Generation.
Yep.
And I read Bad Therapy, and there is a sort of a push up against, therapeutic services. And I'm kind of, my feeling when I was reading that book, I was thinking, I wonder if the rub really is because maybe the approach isn't anchored in something. And so I would love to hear like what you guys, what you do. Are
Sure.
you working with families or kids or
Yeah, we work with all different kinds. But the truth is that there is a lot of bad therapy. Like there just is.
yeah.
And I tell people all the time, there are counselors who should not be counselors. There are congressmen who should not be congressmen. There are doctors who should not be doctors. And but by the grace of God, we all go, right? And so I was able to build Anchored to be something that I wanted it to be because I've been in ministry for a really long time and I've seen it. I've seen really bad counseling and I've seen really great counseling. And I love it because it's a front seat to watching God do very particular work in the lives of hurting and suffering people and people trying to figure things out. And so I think not all counselors are created equal in terms of skill and understanding. And there's so much that needs to go into that. I think having a theological grounding is wildly important. And if you're going to get counseling as a Christian, not to have a counselor who can't tie it into an understanding of your faith, it is going to be like a balloon that you let go and you're like, well, why is it flying through the air? Well, it's flying through the air because it's helium in it and it's not tied to anything. So yeah, I think having counseling that is tied into your faith as the most integral piece, because it's God who's creating us who he wants us to be. We are part of a body. And so, yeah, I think it's really important to have a really good counselor. What I think.
Yeah. Well, it's like you need, we all need sort of external people on the outside,
Yes,
reminding us of God's truth and promises over us and
Yeah.
reminding us that when the days ahead are not always sunny, that God is still with us and for us. And we remain in a firm foundation as we move through the ebb and flows of what life brings to us. And so I think it's really beautiful and so important. The anchoring, I think, is so important. We talk a lot about faith through the imagination and sparking the imagination, and that can sort of sound abstract. And I tend to think we don't really wander into faith, but we are, guided, and we have community to kind of help point us in that direction. So Rebekah, we were talking a lot about like what is happening with kids and anxiety and depression. We think a lot about that in Storymaker world, but inadvertently that affects parents too. And, we also Surgeon General saying parents aren't okay either. No one's okay, I guess.
Okay.
And, what would you have to say to like the parent who's feeling anxious and maybe feeling ill-equipped as they, are trying to shepherd these children that they've been given?
Yeah. Well, there's two sides to this coin. And the first side is, you're not equipped. It's true. Like none of us are actually. None of us know, even as find a parenting expert and then give them their own child and they're going to go, I am so out of my depth here. And you're going to feel unequipped all of the time because in some ways we always will be. Once you get through that first stage and you're like, I got this stage, they're into a next stage. And you're like, oh, I get this one. And then they're on to, I have a 13-year-old and I'm looking at her going, holy moly, I'm like running a women's ministry out of my home. I'm closer to this than I've ever been. It's a lot easier to teach people the right thing to do than to do it yourself. And so to feel ill-equipped, maybe just lacking in an understanding, I'm going, yeah, aren't we all? So that's one point. I think the other side of the coin is we can't know it all, and you're also not supposed to know it all. So as you're on this journey, as your kids are on this journey of faith, this is about you just as much as it's about them. And not because it's a platitude, but because the reality of trusting God in the midst of learning how to do that, we can look at it and go, I don't know what I'm doing all the time, but it's actually okay. It's okay because Jesus does know what he's doing. And I'm so out of my depth when he's not. And so as a parent, if I'm not clinging to him, then it is going to feel like we are in a storm and I need a life raft and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find it. And so being able to first and foremost cling to Jesus in your own relationship with him and your own foundation of faith is going to be vital to being able to trust God when you get to the parenting piece and you're like, yeah, no idea what I'm doing.
And I mean, I think, that we are being shaped by the experience in of itself,
100%,
and
yes.
it's right. You're constantly in a learning and humble phase. This last week, and I was in Texas, speaking with parents with young children, and and I just it's a hard it's hard and beautiful and joyful and all of
Mhm.
those things mixed up. But I am 100% with you in that we ourselves as grownups need to be tethered to the source, so
Mhm.
that we are, you know, I
Which
think
is also hard to do.
it's so hard to do. And I think we get in these tricky spaces. I mean, it's just human nature, when we forget that we're creatures and we're not the creators. And as parents, it's hard not to see ourselves as creatures too, in the stewarding of our kids. And so it gets it gets really dicey when we think it's all up to us and their future is like all up to us. And then it gets worse when we think their salvation is all up to us. And
Yeah.
then the clenching and grace like goes out the door because it's not accessible to our own personal lives.
Yes. Yep. 100%. Mhm.
And so Rebekah, like intermixing between, so you've got two ministries going on at the same time. How do
Mhm.
you see those things sort of interfacing with each other?
Yeah, I ebb and flow. I mean, people ask all the time, "How do you do all this?" And I'm going, "Probably not very well." Like, there's a lot of balls that I drop. If I haven't emailed you back, I'm really sorry. Um, but they do all intersect because we're learning how to love each other. We're learning how to care for one another. I love story makers because it's this. I think in a lot of ways, even how you guys build out your program and your curriculum, it gets me out of my rigidness in even a theological grit. I mean, I'm a master's of divinity, right? And I'm like, man, I want to know the theology because I want to get things right. And it doesn't always function that way. And life doesn't function that way. And so I think it's a really beautiful intersect between I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. And they all actually intersect with each other because it's about loving people. It's about caring for people. And it's about building ministries that actually function in a way to serve the body of Christ. And so I don't really distinct. I mean, I have to be organized and I have administration help and all these kinds of things. But really, weaving them in and out together is kind of the key for me. Did that
Yeah.
answer your question?
Yeah, no, I know it's amazing. And also this, it made me think about too, this intersection between, like the social emotional well-being of our kids and
Mhm.
grown-ups. And because you have this theological background, which I love so much, and biblical background, where would you say to parents, like, in the stories in biblical literacy, like what stories would you point us to, or should we cling to as we're sort of trying to understand like our human nature and where God is
Mhm.
meeting us emotionally?
Yeah. Well, there's this a theological understanding and foundation, and I often think about it like a grid. I want to be tethered to the grid. I want to build a foundation. But when you think about being Imago Dei, when you think about the character of God, when you think about the vastness of his artistry and how he creates and how many people, you can get on the subway and you're like, I've never seen 20 people that looked this different from each other. Or even in New York City, you can go eat any kind of food in the world from any different kind of country. And it broadens an understanding that we have a God so big and his artistry is beyond what we can even begin to understand in a creative space, that I really have to look at the theology and the grid work and say, okay, I want to be tethered to this. I want to have understanding from God's word because he's given it to us. But I also need to have an understanding that there's a lot I don't know because
Mm,
he is a creative God. I am created to reflect him, right? My worth actually comes from
very
the reality that I'm created in his image.
Mhm.
And that value isn't just because it's me intrinsic of myself, but it's actually because I'm created after him and he's an incredible creator. I can't even wrap my brain around it. So when you think about leaning into the creativeness of understanding and the wonder of understanding, for someone with my personality, it can be a little bit more difficult to let go and go, well, there's really not an answer for some of these things. Am
Mhm.
I going to be okay with it? Where can I be tethered to a theological understanding of something, but then have the freedom to walk out as the reflected image of God and go, well, he's a really big creator and I don't know everything.
Yeah. And I think that's really helpful for parents too, right? As like kids ask really hard questions. A few years back, I was at a conference and a mom, we gave this whole like engagement and connection and through art and, the whole thing. And at the end, one mom asked, and she said, well, how do we make sure like our kids are Christians? Like, that's what I'm, really worried about. And that's like the heartbeat and of the question. And so, I think that, it's hard to live into that space, right, of like the vastness of God and entrusting that our most precious people in our lives belong to him and that he's more for them than we could ever be. Do you come across that, Rebekah, like that kind of anxiety or fear?
Yes. Yeah. And I think, well, number one, you can't make sure that your kids are saved. That's not your job. So there's freedom in that's not your job. So you got to release that. But also, as a parent, do you know that Jesus loves you? Just as a parent, just as a woman, just as a man, then as a husband or a wife or as a mom or a dad, like, do you understand the love of Christ? I don't. That's really hard for me to grasp because I'm such a doer. I'm a worker. Man, I'm a New Yorker. Like, I'm going to get things done. And I can be so task oriented that it's hard for me to stop and to really relish in the understanding that I'm loved by God. I'm loved by Jesus. And that changes everything. When, as a parent, I'm able to sit and receive that, which I do very poorly. So don't hear me saying this and going that I get it. Cause I'm do as I'm saying, not as I do, but that translates into our parenting. That translates into a kid going, I don't know what I think about faith, but I know that my parents felt loved by God. And that seeped into the veins of my relationship with my parents, or how we did dinner time, or how they spoke to me, or how we did homework, or what we talked about on the street. And so I really think we are not the keepers of salvation as parents, period. But I know that if I can translate the love of Jesus to my kids, then regardless of what they end up believing, I know that I did what God called me to.
That's amazing. Everyone hear that really well. And assuming them forward and having our imaginations oriented that they are already in the kingdom. Like, what harm does that do? Like, if we're parenting from a place where our assumption is that they may be in or out, then that's sort of fear-based parenting. And it's going to be really hard to share the stories with them in a way that feels free and also life-giving to ourselves. And so I think I love what you had to say, like really assuming them, relinquishing yourself from, this idea that it's all up to us and we're the creators. But we're just creatures too. And we're cohabitating and like co-learning and co-living and co-creating all together with our kids. And I think that's such an important takeaway, especially as I think grown-ups' imaginations can go in many directions, but oftentimes we assume maybe the worst case scenario or where our kids might go sideways or whatever. And so what harm does it do to assume that they're not good, that there's more for them?
Yes. And that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, is the trust in Jesus, that he has them on their own journey. And we want to be so connected to their journey often that we want to take responsibility for it. So when I trust that the Lord has them on a journey that is better than I could have planned for them, then there's some freedom in that. There's some joy in that. You got to find it and work for it, but it's better than what we can create for ourselves.
Oh, 1,000%. I mean, Rebekah, when you look back on your life, can you sort of see the moments in which like you look back and you think God was like on the move in my life and I had zero idea. And like, now I have the, hindsight to see like that was a magical thing that he did and like moved in my world.
Oh, for sure. I think even recently in the time where we were away from New York City, the things that he did in our life for those years and then bringing us back. I'm a different person than I was when I lived here the last time. And that's purposeful. There's a reason for that. And it doesn't actually mean that everything that I see is better. I think in some ways I have less rose colored glasses in a lot of ways than I did previously. And there's a whole lot of different experiences wrapped up in that response. But I think coming to an understanding as you get older and as you parent that this is really hard. Like all of this is hard. And I don't actually think it's going to get easier. It's really hard, but he's creating me and he is changing me and he's growing me so that I might experience him more, that I might understand his love more. And so that I might then turn out and be able to serve my children and serve my family and serve the people around me better than I could have if I had not suffered.
Yeah, I love that. One thing that we talk a lot about is quality over quantity and in terms of connection. And I think, right, as parents, we want to be really invested in their lives and in their journey. And I think truth be told, there's a part of us as grownups is that we may not be totally aware of it, but we imagine that our kids are extensions and representations of like ourselves. And so we're trying to, mold that in some ways so that they don't embarrass us or they reflect well of us. I think that's all hidden and underneath there, but it's hard to have real connection and know who they are. In that when that's the motive apparatus. Rebekah, do you have any thoughts or ideas around like how parents can stay connected in a really easy ways to remain connected and have this grace forward approach towards your kids?
Yeah, it totally depends on the kid. It depends on what their ages are. And I knowing your kid and knowing what each of them would prefer or respond to the best is important. And oftentimes the best thing is just to ask them. I have a 13-year-old, I have 3 girls. So that is a very distinct experience. And my oldest is 13. And she is very well aware of all the things that I do and my work and my ministry and all these things. And she came home the other day and she was like, I want to process with someone other than you. I was like, okay, what do you mean? She's like, I think I want to go to counseling. So I said, well, great, pick a counselor. I've got 48 of it. Who do you want to talk to? Anyone other than me. And I loved that because she was safe enough with me to tell me what she wanted. And she tell me now, did she need to go to counseling? Is there a presenting massive issue? No, not at this moment. There's really not. She's just 13 and life is hard when you're 13.
There are a lot of feelings and a lot of changes.
So many emotions. We've got all of the emotions. She experiences all of them on a regular basis within an hour. And so I wanted to push back a little bit. I wanted to go, yeah, but why do you got me? Like, you don't need. But instead of doing that, the Lord gave me enough grace in that moment to go, sure, pick a counselor, any counselor. And I think listening to them and knowing who they are, what their personalities are, how they're going to respond. My other 2 responded wildly different. My kids are wildly different from each other, which is kind of annoying. Because I'm like, but I cannot just get one down. Like, figuring out 3 different people.
You just optimize.
Yeah, and so I think knowing who they are and what they need and how they respond, and just trying things. Like maybe you try something and they don't respond. Okay, let's try something different. And maybe they love going to the playground and they would rather do that than like sit on the bench and talk to you. Okay, well then let's figure out how to interact with them. How can you interact with them in a way that they're going to respond to you and feel loved by you? I think it's important.
Yeah, remaining curious, I think, is so key to the whole thing. Yeah. And also apologizing, right? All the time. As a grown up. Like
we do that a lot.
Losing. There's a pathway to connection when everyone can say they're sorry at the drop of a hat and really kind of like be like, oh yeah, sorry, my bad. Like for real.
Yeah.
As the grown up and,
Yes. And I'll tell you, as they get older, if you have done that with them their whole life, when they get older, they're going to call you out. So we've been very purposeful. Like as parents, I messed up. I shouldn't have done that. I when they were younger, um, I was full-time on staff at a church running a counseling ministry, and I was really struggling with anger with them. And this was probably 10 years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I said, okay, and I'm teaching women across the world, how not to be angry moms. I was an angry mom. And I said, okay, here's what's going to happen. When I feel angry, we're going to stop. We're going to stop. And my oldest, I said, I want you to pray for me. And we're going to ask the Lord to help mom, because clearly I need help. And so I had a baby, like a 2-year-old, and she was like maybe 5, 3 or I don't remember. So there's nothing like a 5-year-old going, dear Jesus, please help mommy, because she's really angry right now and she needs to repent and ask for forgiveness. And you're like, well, that, like, talk about dousing the fire. They just did it. And so for about 2 or 3 months, we like consistently, I'd be like, I'm feeling angry. And she'd be like, all right, we're all praying. We're all gonna pray for mom. And, by that, I taught her that. And so now at 13, she's going, yeah, we need to stop and ask for forgiveness. This isn't gonna go well. And I'm like, man, I taught her that. Like, I taught her to do that. And it's painful now. It's humbling, because you're like, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I have to do that now. So there is, as you teach them that, when they get older, they're going to call you out on it. Just
just a warning. Well, yeah. And that's the bit of being like co-travelers, right? And being a body together, like the family is a microcosm of like the bigger picture. And so, yeah, when you're a co-traveler, if there's no place for forgiveness in your own household, or the ability to say, I'm sorry, then the world and other communities don't have a chance. Like, if we can't do it at home, then how can we do it at church and all the other places? So,
and I will say it's turning the conversation now, because as she does that, now we're talking about grace. So when we do mess up, what does it look like to be gracious to us as we mess up? Because we're still messing up just as much as we were then, even if it looks different. So maybe don't say you need to repent or you need to ask for forgiveness. Maybe say, this is really hard and I'm going to show you grace as we work through this together. So the theology of it's morphing even as we are living together as, creatures.
That's amazing. I love that, Rebekah. Well, Rebekah, before we sign off, I could stay here forever with you. I would love for you to just, maybe think of a story in the Bible that captured your heart, because we always want to tune people into the Bible, the stories that carry us, and maybe open their imaginations to like how God can speak to us through different stories. So if there's something that comes to your mind, but I love to think about like Rahab and like what a surprise, and like how God moved through her life, and like there were spies and all sorts of wild things. But I just love all the tiny surprises that you find throughout the Old Testament of like, right, like God's imagining a different kind of future and pathway, and moves in ways that we can never imagine.
Yeah. I mean, what comes to mind immediately is, I should have probably thought about this question before we got on here, but really I think of Naomi, because Ruth gets so much attention, as she should. Yeah. And in that story, I really think of Naomi as the female Job. When you're looking at her life, I don't think she gets enough credit for she was bitter. We get it. Like, she was upset, but wouldn't we all be? Like, I can't imagine how I would respond if I had been her. But then you see this trajectory of how the journey that she is on, that the Lord takes her on. And so as she comes alongside Ruth, what does it look like for her to actually grow and come back to the Lord in a sense, not self-effacing, but I'm going to continue putting one foot in front of the other and trusting the Lord when everything was taken away from me. And I think there's a lot of power in that story, particularly as a female, and showing that she's going to persevere. And so I think that one sticks out to me the most this moment.
I love that. I never thought about Naomi as Job, but yes, exactly. Guys, that was a great one. We hang on to that. Go back to reading Ruth and check that out. I mean, no, you're so right. I mean, and everything being taken away, not really having a pathway forward for herself.
Yeah. But the difference is, particularly as a female, Job having everything taken away, he can rebuild. With Naomi taken away in that particular context was infinitely worse than a man. So I actually think her situation was maybe a little bit worse than Job, even though Job got a whole book.
You're like,
she was a female. Yeah.
Yeah. What's that about? No, that's, I never even put that together. Jack, that's a good one. Well, Rebekah, we are just so honored to have had this time with you today. And I think grownups out there, whether you're thriving or struggling, remember the stories are enough and they're for you. And also, therapy is also a great resource and tool. And so go on over and check out those resources that Rebekah has to offer through her ministries. And if you are in the New York area and near Lincoln Center on the Upper West Side, go check out Rebekah's ministry. She's got a lot going on over there too.
Come on.
Lots of grace and lots of mercy for all of us, and just covering us in the stories that, brought us all here together. All right. Lots of love to you guys. Thanks, Rebekah.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Today's episode of the Storymakers podcast was made possible by donors and produced by Mockingbird Ministries. Listen to more episodes and join the adventure at storymakersnyc.com. or follow us along on Instagram. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, share the show with a friend, or maybe two, and use the code SMPodcast10 for 10% off your next order. Catch you next time.